Hey there, I'm Dr. T, and in this episode, we're answering the question, why is there so much violence in our families? Well, the first thing you need to understand is that the home is the most violent place in our society. It's much more violent than people think. It's much more prevalent than people think. Just to give you a couple of statistics, women are twice as likely to be raped by their husbands as they are by a stranger. And for women ages 15 to 44, which is the prime childbearing age, after childbirth, domestic violence is the number one reason for being hospitalized if you're in that age group. It is one of the most underreported crimes in our society. So, what do we mean by violence within the family? Well, it includes emotional or psychological abuse, which also includes verbal abuse, things like name calling, put downs, you're worthless, no one else will ever love you, those kinds of things. Physical abuse, hitting, stomping, punching, kicking, pulling hair, slapping, throwing down, threatening with weapons, using weapons, all of those things are physical abuse. Sexual abuse includes not just forcing people to participate in sexual acts, but also forcing them to watch sexual acts, whether performed live in front of them or on a screen or that sort of thing. Financial abuse, getting the money and keeping it away from your partner, making them beg for sanitary items every month when they have their period. That's been known to happen. Controlling behavior in general and isolating behavior, getting your partner away from anyone, friends or family, who might offer some sort of support. Stalking, following around, intimidating, and then neglect is another category. And this is usually where you have some kind of caregiving role or responsibility. So the person's not able to fully take care of themselves. So for children, for elderly family members that might not be able to fully care for themselves, perhaps individuals with disabilities, or a partner may have a chronic or debilitating illness, and you fail to provide care or help or support, that would be neglect. So violence can exist within different relationships in the family. So parent to child, one intimate partner to another, siblings. This is the most under-recognized form of abuse. There's tremendous abuse that goes on between siblings that is not addressed in this country. And it is, the research we have shows, the most damaging form of family violence. And we pay practically no attention to it whatsoever. Elder abuse, and then abuse that goes on between dating partners. So how common is it? It's very hard to know because it is so underreported. And it's also hard to compare statistics because the numbers depend on what you include. So some research on domestic violence only includes the most severe form of violence, what we call battering, where women are beaten very severely physically on a repeated basis. Some will include being harmed one time physically. Some will include psychological abuse. Some will just focus on sexual abuse. So it's very, very hard to get good numbers on this. And as we already said, is underreported. What we have now suggests that at least 25% of women experience some form of violence in their relationship. And I'm going to focus on heterosexual relationships and use she for victim and he for perpetrator, but I will talk about same-sex circumstances as well as we go along, just for shorthand. I'll use that gendered language. And so I said 25% for heterosexual couples. The research suggests the numbers are similar, if not a little bit higher, for same-sex couples, so gay men and lesbian couples. And the numbers for child and sibling abuse are likely higher than that, higher than 25% experience some form of abuse. There is a very strong gender dynamic in the violence we see in families, so that most abusers are boys or men, and most victims are girls or women, and women are more likely to be victimized physically and more harshly than boys and men. But women can be perpetrators, including of physical violence and sexual violence, and men can be victims, again, including of physical violence and sexual violence. So one of the things we need to address when we're understanding why so much violence goes on is the myths that we have, the misunderstandings we have about violence and why it happens and how it happens. So people think that if you really love someone, violence can't occur in that relationship. And that's not true. And we'll talk about how that happens in just a moment. People think family violence is rare, and so that's something that happens to just a few people out there, and we don't have to really think too much about it. Also not true. They think it only happens in poor families. It happens across the economic spectrum. Prominent people in our society have been guilty of family violence. They think that the violence occurs because the abuser just doesn't have good anger management skills or has really poor impulse control. Also not true. We'll talk a little bit more about why in a moment. There's this myth that battered women ask for it or provoke it, which is not only untrue, it's insulting that women would do things to provoke violence to themselves. This is a really important one. The idea that drugs or alcohol abuse are at the root of family violence. Drugs and alcohol do not cause family violence. They are, however, often mixed up with violence because as a culture, we tend to give people a get out of jail free card, men in particular, for what they do when they've been drinking. We give them excuses. We say, oh, he never would have acted like that if he hadn't been drinking. And so men know this, men who want to be abusive, and they will drink to give them an excuse to be violent because they can always go back later and say, oh, baby, you know, I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been drinking. So they use it as an excuse. It is involved, but it is not a cause. And then this idea that the cycle always repeats, that abused children will then become abusive parents. There's a tendency for that to be true. But most children who grow up in that circumstance say, I do not want to do anything like that to my children. And so they actually do work to try to overcome that and break that cycle. So how do people get in abusive relationships? I used to say to my students all the time, no one goes out on a second date with someone who beats them up on the first date. Nobody is that stupid. Nobody. What happens is a slow, gradual process. We call it a grooming process. It starts out with little behaviors that might even seem very endearing in the beginning that turn into control, and then violence comes into the situation. So you might start out with someone who texts a lot and you get excited. Oh, he thought about me. He sent me a little text to say, oh, just thinking about you. Hope you're enjoying your day. Looking forward to seeing you tonight or this weekend or whatever. Oh, he's so thoughtful. I love it. I never had somebody who was so attentive. And those texts over time become, I texted you. Why didn't you text me back? What are you doing? Who are you with? Let me see your phone. I know you're going out with somebody else. You're interested in somebody else. Why are you ignoring me? Or something like, oh my goodness, you know, I love you so much. No one will ever love you as much as I do. No one will ever love you the way that I do. And that can feel endearing in the moment, particularly if you've not had somebody express themselves in quite that effusive of a way. But then over time, that becomes nobody will ever love you. You're worthless. You're lucky to have me. I'm the only person who would put up with you. And so over time, you get conditioned to handle abuse. Something that seemed like it was endearing at first then becomes more abusive. Or things like, I don't want you to go out with your friends tonight. I want you to stay with me. I had this great night planned for us. Like, oh, he really loves me. He wants to be with me. And eventually it's like, I don't want you to go out with your friends. They don't like me. They talk bad about me behind my back. I don't want you hanging out with them. So it's about getting you used to being abused and then isolating you from anybody who would tell you what's going on is not right. Anybody who would help you get out of the situation. The other way that people get trapped in abusive relationships is if the abuser takes financial control. So takes control of all the money, doesn't give you access to it. It's hard to leave if you have to go out with just the clothes on your back. People have done it, but it's extremely difficult, particularly if you have children. And of course, they wait until they've got you hooked. They wait until you're attached and until you're in love with them before they show you the violent part of their nature. But most of all, the one thing you have to remember is that people use violence because it works, because it gets them what they want. And they're very strategic about it. This is why it's not about impulse control and it's not about anger management, because most people who are abusive are not that way outside the home. They show other people a completely different side of themselves. And they save that abuse in the home for where they're trying to maintain control. And so that a lot of people outside have no idea what's going on because they're so good at switching back and forth and changing how they look to people. So why is there so much violence? Well, the big reason is that there's very little accountability or punishment for it in our culture. Very few people are ever charged, prosecuted, and even fewer are convicted. And if they are, they're not harshly sentenced. Terrible things don't happen to them. They don't go away for periods of time that people who are convicted of assaulting people outside the family get sentenced for. And we as a culture don't treat it like it's a real problem for us to solve. Because what do we ask? If we find out that somebody is in an abusive situation, we say, well, why doesn't she just leave? Forgetting the ways in which she, or maybe not understanding the ways in which she's been controlled. And her option, she's been cut off from people who might help her. And she doesn't have financial resources. And she might have children she has to worry about. Children are the number one reason that women don't leave sooner in a relationship. And many of them try multiple times before they're actually successful. But we put the onus on her with that question. Why doesn't she just leave? We should be asking the question, why does he beat her? Because that's where the culpability lies. That's where the responsibility lies. He's making a choice to beat her and to harm her because it gets him what he wants. There's another question we could ask, which really turns the mirror around. Why do we let him beat her? Why do we let so many people harm their families with no consequences whatsoever? That's on us.